Welcome. I'm Faye Waterman, the host of Talking All Things Business. This show is all about you and your business, what you do, why you do it, and your passion. And today's guest is Gary Orr. And Gary is a qualified interior designer, previously a clinical psychiatrist with a global background in nutrition and healthcare systems. Welcome, Gary, and thank you for your time.
Hi, Faye. Thanks very much for that introduction. It's really great to be on the show and to have an opportunity to talk about my background and how I came to be an interior designer now based in Melbourne, working with both residential and commercial clients here in this incredible city.
Yes. It's quite amazing, isn't it? So what is your background? Let's talk a little bit about where you come from and how you got to where you are today.
So very briefly, I was actually born in South Africa. And that's where a lot of my initial kind of taste around design and fashion came in, because I was born into a retail family in South Africa where the family business was actually chain of department stores. So I kind of had this slightly crazy childhood where I was actually quite literally brought up in the confines of having access to a chain of 45 department stores across sub-Saharan Africa. But what that did when I was a kid, it gave me the opportunity to experience color, design, and fashion trends and how that actually influences how we function as human beings and how we interact with each other. But it was also an incredible experience because it meant that I was from a very early age exposed to global travel, to other cultures. But within that context, if I was with my parents on, say, a buying trip in London or in Paris or somewhere in Switzerland, that I was being exposed to the cutting edge of fashion design as it was then. And that was from a very early age. And I can remember, I've got kind of very graphic memories of some of my early experiences of when I was actually experimenting with color as a 9-10-year-old. And there was one experience when we were building a house in Johannesburg, and my brothers and I were all brought up as particular individuals. But, mum turned around and kind of said, well, what color would you like your bedroom? And it was very much a case of, okay, I can, have any color. And, at the age of, I think, 9 or 10, came up with this kind of color scheme that was vibrant and deep and kind of contrasting. And that was really my very early experience of being able to influence the space that I personally actually lived in. From there, and unfortunately, one of the issues of the South Africa that I grew up in was obviously apartheid and the violence that went with that. And I was very fortunate enough that I was able to be educated both at secondary school and university in the UK, which was a very formative part of my experience. And that exposed me to having to live in a new culture, having to get used to interacting in different ways, understanding how different people interacted. And I went to a school in the UK that drew pupils from multiple different countries across the world, which meant that I was actually beginning to interact with different cultures on all sorts of different levels. And at that time, and this is going back to the 80s, fairly soon after, there was the OPEC crisis, and then there was the kind of financial crisis of, the late 80s and 87. And it was touch and go as to whether I, went and did architecture at university or whether I went into medical school. And I kind of landed up going into medical school because medicine was kind of deemed to be a fairly safe career, and you're always going to have a job and that sort of thing.
And architecture wasn't? But
and certainly in kind of the mid to late 80s, architecture was still it was a less secure profession than I think it is today. And although my mother was actually an interior designer, both in South Africa and in the UK when they moved to the UK.
So you all moved to UK as a family?
No, I actually commuted to school in the UK from the age of 14.
Right. So your parents still lived in South Africa while
Yeah.
you were in the UK?
Yeah.
Okay.
So we commuted backwards and forwards to school. So I had this slightly crazy lifestyle where at the age of 14 thought nothing of getting on an aeroplane and spending 14 hours going back to Johannesburg.
Yeah. But what was it like when you first moved from home to the UK where you knew no one?
It was both daunting and exciting and exhilarating, and it was a little bit like, wow, there are a whole series of new experiences that life opens up for you. And although I have a deep love of South Africa and a lot of things African, I suddenly found myself being able to experience new cultures, new people, and we actually bring those new experiences into our life. And when I was in the UK, I gained an interest in historical design, in historical architecture, and was exposed to a different way of living, a different climate, and an innate understanding of how the environment around us, the climate around us, the architecture around us actually influences the way we function as people. It influences whether we spend time inside, whether we go outside, whether we have large open spaces that we entertain in, whether we retreat into warm, cozy environments in the winter when it's cold and raining outside, and how that then reflects on how we feel as people and how we take things forward.
So it plays on our emotions, really, doesn't it? The colours, the size of the room, the colours, the textures, and all those sorts of things. So when you're looking and designing I suppose, a whole home or a room, what are the sort of things that you look for? You'd obviously have a conversation with the people that you're going to do the design for. You get a feel for what they like and the colours and things like that. What do you bring into it, which is a uniqueness?
I think the uniqueness starts right from the beginning, and having had a 25-year career working across major healthcare systems, working with teams, organizing people, and understanding human function and behavior at a psychological level and a scientific level, the way I actually interact with clients is when I meet a client, I don't just want to know what colors they like or what style they like. I actually need to understand how they live, whether it be a single person, whether it be a couple, whether it be a family. How do they live in their home? What do they do? And some clients kind of, get slightly taken aback. And a very simple example is when I'm talking to clients about sofas and couches in their living room, I say to them, how do you actually sit on a couch? What do you use this for? Do you watch TV lying down, sitting up? How do you actually function in that space? And people go, actually, I've never really thought about that. And it does really influence the choice of furniture. And I use the example of a couch because very often that's actually one of the bigger ticket items in a room. But it then goes beyond that. It goes into, how do you live? So when you have friends around, when the family's around, if it's just the two of you in the space, do you need separate spaces because one of you's maybe still studying, doing an evening class? Do you need a separate space for computer work? Do you work together? How do you interact? And how do we actually live in the spaces that we occupy? And the same applies to commercial spaces in terms of office spaces and spaces that people work in, because each space will need to have a different series of functions.
Yeah.
And it's about then being able to marry up the functional needs of the space and then working out how you actually design that space. And then it's about actually talking to people about where they've traveled, where they've been, what they enjoy doing. Do they enjoy cooking? Do they enjoy reading? If they enjoy reading, have they got a library? Do they listen to music from, vinyl discs, or do they use CDs, or do they use Spotify? Because each one of those applications will have a different need in terms of how you design the space. So I literally sit down with an individual, a couple, a family, and take a history from them and get to know them and get to understand them. And then we can begin to work on what the design needs are of the home, the office, and then we start taking account of the style of the building, the flow of the building, whether this is an old Victorian cottage, which is what my home is at the moment. And, how does that then actually reflect the passion of the people that live in there? Because a lot of people will turn around and go, oh, well, do you have a particular style? And I personally have a particular style in terms of the space that I live in. But for me as an interior designer, it's not about me telling people what style of place they need to live in. It's about working with people to collaboratively create their own style and create a space that they're comfortable in.
Yeah.
Because I think a lot of people think that employing an interior designer is a very intimidating process, because you're suddenly going to get an expert that says, well, this year's trend is, green and contrasting yellows.
Yeah, but this year's trend can be next year's out, or 20
Precisely.
years. Yes. So when you're having that conversation with them, and they're a little bit, you create that curiosity with them, because you're actually asking them how they live, when they're expecting you to say, this is how you should live or could live. So you switch that around and ask them the questions, and then take from that things that they've said, and then have another conversation with them to really grasp each aspect of their lives and how it functions, so that then you can fit that functionality into their lifestyle.
Yes, absolutely. And I think a lot of people will go, oh, well, I've inherited this piece of furniture, or I was traveling in India and came across these fabrics that I bought at a market. And I used the latter as an example, because I actually used that in an apartment that I did in London several years ago, where I was working with a couple who traveled extensively. And when I walked in to their previous home, I saw bolts of fabric just on the floor. And we were talking about curtains and things, and I went, well, hang on, you've got a whole series of bolts of fabric sitting on the floor. Well, where did you get those from? And they went, well, actually, we bought those on our honeymoon in Marrakesh, in Morocco. And I went, well, have you ever thought of actually maybe we can use those as curtains in your bedroom? And they kind of went, oh, we'd actually never thought of that. So, what we did was we actually used the fabric that they'd bought on honeymoon at a market in Marrakesh, which was actually, beautiful hand-woven silk.
Oh, very nice.
And we were able to turn that into their bedroom curtains.
Yeah.
So it's about actually drawing out somebody's personality.
Yeah.
And I think what a lot of people get quite intimidated by is we live in a world where social media puts forward the story of we've all got to have glamorous lifestyles and live in a certain way and that sort of thing.
So it's influential, isn't it? It's like people are very easily influenced by the trends and everything. And what I say about fashion is what you want. It's not what anyone else wants, because, you know, the fashion changes, and you would know this, that it recycles itself every 30 to 40 years, because you look at the fashions and what's out there and what the trends are. And I will look at things that I used to wear when I was a kid that's in fashion now. Or 10 years ago, there'll be other things that I used to wear as a kid that's in fashion now, and everybody loves it. But it's a personal thing too. It's not about what the real trend is. It's what the trend for you is, and what you feel comfortable with, and how you want to either wear it or sit in it, or what colors you want, and how easily you can change that if you choose to change it. So, you know, it can be simple or it can be overwhelming, can't it?
Oh, absolutely. And I think, you know, today the range of fabrics, textiles, furniture that people can choose from is hugely overwhelming.
Yes.
And that's where actually employing an expert like myself, who knows the range of products out there, and go, okay, you know, this is your budget, this is where we need to sit, this is where we need to look, and this is how we can then make things work. And I think your point around trends and fashion is incredibly important, because fashion and trends are really interesting, because they follow the diktats of current political circumstances, current availability. And if you look at a very good example was the Christian Dior exhibition that was on at the NGV last year. And you look at the style of how the house evolved, and the style that was coming out in the immediate post-war period, where clothing tended to be much more utilitarian. It was narrowly cut because of the scarcity of fabric, and quite bland because people were in the midst of a global economic gloom because of, you know, what had just happened in terms of the Second World War. And then, you know, you move into mid-century and that kind of sort of freeing up of design and the experiment of mid-century design and how colors evolve and
The freedom.
And different color palettes evolve. And then that coincided with the political and sociological freedom that took place, and that early experimentation of the, you know, 50s, 60s and into the 70s. And then again, there was, you know, issues around kind of economic change and economic crisis with the OPEC crisis of 75. And so fashion changed again. Yes. And when you look at what's happening now, we've been through a revival of mid-century design and appreciation of mid-century design, an appreciation of the utilitarian simplicity of mid-century furniture. But that's also mirrored by the fact that we're living in cities that are much denser, the spaces that we live in are much smaller, and mid-century furniture just happens to generally be of a smaller utilitarian size that can fit in a small urban apartment.
Yes.
And those trends are still happening. And then what we're also seeing is shifts in color and shifts in different types of textiles that are used. And one of the big trends that's happening at the moment is floral textiles that are very much coming back into the fore. And I would argue that, you know, the world has been through a relatively difficult patch. We're still creating recovery from the GFC, which admittedly was 10 years ago, but that recovery is now beginning and is a little bit more concrete. So what we're actually seeing is that people are beginning to experiment with color, and pattern and textural contrast. So we've got a whole new trend coming up, and then that trend will subside again in a few years' time and something else will happen. And that's the challenge of being an expert in terms of design, because people don't want to redesign their house according to some fashion trend that has happened, and suddenly they have a house that is full of floral fabrics and textiles, but in 5 years' time that's out of date. So my view is, how is somebody comfortable in their space? Very much in the same way, how are you comfortable with what you wear?
Yes.
It's the same thing. And it's creating that persona, that profile in terms of what I'm comfortable wearing. So I need to surround myself with that comfort of the way I live as well.
That's right. And that, you know, what you wear just expands into your living areas, and you do create, I suppose we all kind of have a theme of how we want to live and the things that we want to surround ourselves with. You'll find people that travel a lot and they pick up lots of different artifacts and things like that. They might want a room that is particularly there to display all those things, or they might want to display them throughout the house itself. So you would bring in all those kind of things into those areas so that they could have what they want. I think that the concept of an interior designer is that the interior designer just frees you up and you don't have to think about anything. But it's not the interior designer's job to actually go in and change everything. They give ideas, but as you said, you find out how they live. Take a couch, for instance, how they sit on it. I would never have thought about that. You know, you sit on it, you lie on it, you share it, you whatever. But how do you live? How do you use your furniture and things like that is a really important thing when you're, particularly if you've built a new home and you want to fit it out, and you've got a person such as yourself to help you do that and give you ideas. But you need to develop that understanding of who they are, and they need to develop the understanding of what they actually do want.
Oh, totally. And I think also have the confidence to be able to display their personality in their home. And a lot of people take a lot of time to evolve the confidence in terms of what they wear. Mm-hmm. But what also a lot of people do is resort to the path of least resistance. So knowing that when I go to work in the morning as an accountant, for example, that actually wearing a grey suit is acceptable and easy, and a grey suit and a white shirt and tie, well, I'm not going to stand out and I'm going to fit in. But does that really reflect who I am? Am I the bright, dashing accountant who's going to be just a little bit different? Well, in which case then just slightly shift the cut of your suit, just slightly shift the white shirt to a different color, create a contrast.
Or something like that.
Begin to just shift and begin to experiment. And then as you experiment with the perhaps relative discomfort of a guy wearing a pink shirt, so when we come to our home, and then one of the things that people often go, well, we stayed in this kind of design hotel in Bali, and we kind of quite like the kind of cream couches that they had in their reception space. And I'm going, yeah, great guys, but you've got a cat, a dog, and 3 young kids. So actually kind of white cotton sofas are probably not going to cut it. But actually, let's take that relaxed environment and let's work with that, but actually create something that works for you as a family. So that's where my expertise comes in. And instead of having, the kind of white couches that you reclined on your Bali holiday, well, let's take some other aspects of Balinese culture and bring in some Balinese fabrics, some batiks, some, of that kind of beautiful, kind of multicolored tropical island feel. Let's bring that into your home and let's shift that around. And they go, we hadn't actually thought about that.
Yeah. It's a practicality of it, isn't it? Because they see something like that, which is really quite glamorous and feels really nice, but they don't think of the practicalities of the day-to-day wear and tear of it, and whether they've got animals or children, not practical in a normal living area. They could have it in another part of their house, but not in the normal living areas. So, yeah, you point out the fact that it isn't practical, but there are other aspects of what they saw they can bring in, which is a really nice thing, because everyone has a different taste, and you draw on that, and then you draw on that and then bring in more creativity too, to make it a really nice feel for them.
Oh yeah, absolutely. And it's how you can then bring in different aspects of what works for that couple, that family. And it's really important to be able to think that what we're doing is establishing a collaborative approach where it's a group of the designer, my expertise, coming to the expertise of the people that live in the home or work in that office environment. Because I'm an expert interior designer, but I'm not an expert on how that particular client family will live in their home. And I think what a lot of people don't understand is that the best expert on themselves is themselves.
Yes, absolutely. So if you were to give 3 tips on how to select an interior designer in the first instant, what would you look for? And what else would you suggest? So 3 tips on selecting an interior designer, having a fair idea of what they want, and having that flexibility to change, or whatever there, and something else that you can suggest.
Finding an interior designer is actually, it's about finding someone who you can personally relate to. Yes. And it could be about interviewing several designers, and it's about going, who do I actually want to work with? So it's a little bit like, how do you select your hairdresser, your personal trainer, your GP? Those are all very different professionals, but they're all people who interact with you on a very personal level. And so too, your interior designer interacts with you on a very personal level. And it's about, how do we get on? How do we relate to each other as people? Does my interior designer understand what I'm after? And is my interior designer going to work with me to create the space I want to live in, rather than impose their style on me? That's not, to me, that's just not appropriate, and quite frankly, quite arrogant. Whereas I think developing that collaborative approach, so that you bring out that person's style and you give that person the confidence to be able to walk into their own space and go, wow, I'm at home. This is now my relaxing, quiet, secure space. Or, wow, I've just walked into my office, and my office is this creative, stimulating environment that reflects the brand and the personality of who I am and what I do. So it's personal relationships are incredibly important.
Yes.
It's an interior designer who has the expertise in terms of the skill to bring the job together, but also has the knowledge of where to get different products from and understands how textiles, materials will interact with each other, and then also understands color at a scientific level, because I think what a lot of people don't get is that some colors work in some spaces, some colors don't work in some spaces, but also the way we interact with color as people. Some colors can dull our mood, some colors will brighten our mood, some colors can stimulate creativity, some colors can be soulful and relaxing and calming. And it's about understanding that. You're not going to paint a child's nursery bright yellow because it's just too stimulating. And equally, you've got to understand that depending on where, you know, the particular space is, certain colors can work in that country or not.
Yeah.
And a very good example is understanding that, you know, having lived in the UK for as long as I have done, the color palette that is used in the Northern Hemisphere is very different to the Southern Hemisphere color palette. And it's in part our climate in terms of we tend to spend more time outside, but it is also, quite frankly, the color of the sunlight.
Yeah.
The color of the sunlight in Australia is very different to that if you're in Northern Europe, but then in different parts of Australia, it is also different.
Yes.
So if you're doing a job up in Brisbane, the color palette that you're going to use there will be different to that in Melbourne, where we do experience cold winters and we do retreat inside in cold winters. So we want part of our home to be cosseting and warm in that cold weather, but also we have hot summers. So we want part of our home to be cool and expansive to cope with the heat in the summer. And it's understanding that difference.
Yeah. Now, how can they get in contact with you, Gary?
Best way of getting in contact with me is to call me on my mobile, to drop me an email through garyalldesign@gmail.com, through Facebook, through Instagram, and my website will be coming up and online probably in the next month to 6 weeks, and that is garyalllifestyledesign.com.au.
Beautiful, beautiful. And I would like to say thank you so much for your wisdom and expertise and honesty in talking about how, you know, design and how you've brought in what your experience as a child growing up with all materials, fabrics, textiles, colors, and all those sorts of things. So the experience that you've had all through your life, and then going into the psychiatric side of things and learning that that other aspect of people's lives. So learning that and then bringing the two together to be able to work out what people truly want and have that intuitive feeling and know what they're really saying. So thank you.
That's awesome. Thanks very much, Faye. Much appreciated.
That's a pleasure.